You've got friends where power lives, and they don't miss when it comes to you. The hunter who thought you were alone never realized the forest was armed. Let that land. Because while they were watching you stumble, counting your losses, celebrating every delay, they missed the most dangerous detail of all. You were never unguarded. You were never exposed. You were never operating without backup. And that miscalculation is the reason they're already losing. Let me say it plainly, and let me say it loud enough for the enemy to hear. You have allies in places they'll never reach, and those allies do not play about protecting what they've chosen. They thought your quiet meant you were weak. They thought your patience meant you were passive. They thought your refusal to react meant you had no power. That's how small minds interpret restraint. That's how insecure people misread discipline, and that's why they kept testing you, poking you, pushing you, thinking eventually you'd crack, self-destruct, or expose yourself. But here's the truth they're just now starting to feel. You don't need to bark when you've got teeth behind the scenes. You didn't imagine the near misses. You didn't overthink the sudden reversals. You weren't crazy for wondering why certain attacks never landed, why certain plans against you collapsed without explanation, why doors reopened after they were slammed shut. That question that's been looping in your mind, how did I survive that, has a simple answer they never want you to realize. You're chosen, and being chosen doesn't mean you're loud, it means you're covered. Let's address the enemy directly for a moment, because they're listening whether they admit it or not. You should have finished what you started when you had the chance. You should have understood that some people aren't attacked because they're weak, but because they're dangerous. You mistook access for control, you mistook proximity for power, and you mistook silence for surrender. Big mistake. Because while you were running your mouth, someone else was running interference. While you were setting traps, someone else was dismantling them. While you were gathering allies in public, someone else was handling things in private. The kind of private rooms where decisions don't get debated, they get executed. Here's what the chosen need to understand right now, because I know the questions forming in your head. Why me? Why did I survive when others didn't? Why does it feel like something unseen keeps stepping in at the last second? It's not favoritism, it's function. You weren't selected because you're perfect. You were selected because you're precise, because you don't fold under pressure, because you don't sell your integrity for comfort, because when you're tested, you adapt instead of collapse. Power notices that. Real power, the kind that doesn't post, doesn't brag, doesn't need applause. Being chosen doesn't mean life gets easier. It means life gets strategic. That's why your battles have felt unfair. That's why the opposition has felt excessive. That's why the resistance never matched the situation on the surface. You weren't dealing with random hostility. You were dealing with fear. Fear of what you carry. Fear of what you could become if left uninterrupted. Fear of what happens when someone like you is allowed to grow. And here's the part that should give you chills. The people protecting you saw that outcome before the enemy did. They saw your trajectory. They saw your restraint. They saw how you move when no one is watching. They saw that you don't need chaos to win. They saw that you don't need to destroy others to rise. And they decided you were worth preserving, not out of kindness, but out of calculation. Because some assets are too valuable to let amateurs sabotage. So, when you ask yourself why certain people who came for you ended up losing everything, stop calling it coincidence. When you notice how the loudest threats eventually went silent, stop calling it luck. When you realize how often things shift in your favor right when the pressure peaks, stop downplaying it. That's not chance. That's coverage. You're moving through life with an unseen perimeter, and the reason your enemies are getting reckless right now is because they can feel it. They can feel that their access to you is shrinking. They can feel doors closing that they don't have keys for. They can feel influence slipping through their fingers, and nothing terrifies a controlling person more than losing control without understanding how. Here's your motivation, chosen one. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to announce your power. You don't need to fight every battle you're invited to. All you need to do is keep moving forward with discipline, because every step you take triggers protection they can't interrupt. Let them underestimate you. Let them talk. Let them assume you're on your own. Predators panic when they realize the prey has an army. And the most dangerous thing about your situation isn't that you're protected. It's that you're starting to realize it. Before we go any further, pause for a moment and really sit with this truth. If you're still here after everything meant to break you, that is not an accident. That's evidence. Something stepped in when it mattered, and deep down, you felt it, even if you couldn't explain it. I want you to be honest with yourself right now. What's the moment in your life that should have ended you, but didn't? Where did you see a door open, a threat disappear, or a situation flip at the last second? Write it in the comments. Your story matters, and your courage to speak might be the confirmation someone else is waiting for. Number 1, unbreakable by design. Survival isn't an accident. It's proof that your core was stronger than every attempt to erase you. You are built to withstand the blow, not to beg for mercy. They didn't fail to destroy you because they lacked effort. They failed because you were never made to break. Because survival like yours isn't random. It isn't luck. It isn't timing. It's design. And that fact alone should hit the enemy harder than any retaliation ever could. You're still here, not because they didn't try, but because every attempt to erase you collided with something in you that wouldn't give way. They threw pressure at you expecting collapse. They applied force, assuming fracture. They counted on fear, exhaustion, isolation, and doubt to finish what they started. And when none of it worked, confusion turned into obsession. That's what happens when people mistake resilience for arrogance and endurance for weakness. Let's clear something up for the chosen ones listening right now, because I know the questions rising in your mind. Why did it have to be this hard? Why was I targeted so intensely? Why did it feel like everything was designed to push me past my limits? Here's the answer they'll never say out loud. Ordinary structures don't require extraordinary pressure to collapse. Only something solid demands that much force. You weren't attacked because you were fragile. You were attacked because you were intact. Think about it like this. Nobody tests the strength of a cheap material. You don't put stress on what you already know will fail. Pressure is reserved for what matters. Pressure is applied where resistance exists. Pressure is used to identify what can hold weight without shattering. And when you didn't break the first time, or the second, or the third, they didn't back off. They doubled down. That's how you know you're different. The enemy thought survival would humble you into submission. Instead, it carved discipline into your bones. They thought loss would shrink you. Instead, it sharpened your instincts. They thought silence would suffocate you. Instead, it taught you how to move without being detected. Every hit you absorbed without losing yourself rewired you. Every setback that didn't destroy your core reinforced it. You weren't being worn down. You were being tempered. And that's the part that should scare them. Because an unbroken person after sustained pressure isn't just resilient, they're dangerous. You didn't survive by being louder. You didn't survive by fighting dirtier. You didn't survive by becoming like them. You survived by staying structurally sound while chaos tried to pull you apart. That kind of survival sends a message whether you intend it to or not. This one cannot be erased. They don't like that message. That's why they try to rewrite the story. They call you lucky. They say you slipped through cracks. They claim circumstances changed. Anything to avoid admitting the truth, that their best efforts weren't enough. But you know better. You know how close it got. You know how heavy it was. You know how many nights felt like the breaking point. And you also know the moment you realized something important. I'm still standing. That realization is power. quiet power. The kind that doesn't need to threaten because it already survived what was meant to end it. Being chosen doesn't mean you're immune to damage. It means damage doesn't define you. It means you absorb impact without losing form. It means when pressure comes, you adapt instead of disintegrate. And that's why you're still a problem for people who wanted you gone. They wanted a reaction. You gave them endurance. They wanted collapse. You gave them continuity. They wanted you to self-destruct. You gave them proof. Proof that whatever blueprint you were built from wasn't cheap. Here's what the enemy still doesn't understand. Every failed attempt strengthened your position. Every time they pushed and you didn't fall, their leverage weakened. Every time they tried to break you publicly and failed, your presence quietly grew heavier. You didn't just survive the test, you passed it. And now the pressure has shifted, because pressure always exposes both sides. It didn't just reveal your strength, it revealed their limits. It showed how far they were willing to go, how desperate they became, how reckless they got when control slipped out of their hands. That's not your burden to carry, that's their exposure. So if you're wondering what to do next, here's the answer that will frustrate them the most. You keep going exactly as you are. You don't over-explain. You don't seek permission. You don't dilute yourself to make others comfortable. Structures that survive stress don't apologize for their integrity. Let them remember this every time they see you still standing. You weren't spared. You were built. And everything they threw at you proved it. Number 2, the truth you were never meant to notice. When you start questioning patterns instead of blaming yourself, clarity replaces confusion. The moment you stopped blaming yourself, the system lost its grip on you. That's the line they never wanted you to cross. Because as long as you thought everything happening to you was your fault, you were controllable. As long as you internalized the chaos, questioned your worth, doubted your instincts, and replayed every setback as a personal failure, you stayed exactly where they needed you, confused, exhausted, and looking inward instead of outward. But something shifted the moment you started noticing patterns, not excuses, not coincidences, patterns, the repeated resistance, the strangely timed obstacles, the familiar types of people showing up to slow you down, the way progress always seemed to trigger interference, the way silence from certain directions felt intentional, not accidental. That's when confusion started losing its hold and clarity began replacing it. And clarity is dangerous, because clarity leads to questions, and questions expose systems. You weren't imagining it. You weren't unlucky. You weren't doing everything wrong. The friction you experienced wasn't random chaos. It was response, reaction, pushback. You were moving in a direction that required containment, and containment always leaves fingerprints. Here's the part that hits the enemy hard. The moment you realized the pattern wasn't about you being flawed, it became about you being significant. Think about it. Nobody invests energy into stopping something irrelevant. Nobody coordinates resistance against something harmless. Obstacles don't organize themselves. Pressure doesn't appear without cause. When disruption follows you consistently, it's not because you're failing, it's because you're affecting something. That's why the narrative had to be flipped on you early. That's why self-blame was encouraged. That's why you were told to work harder, be quieter, adjust yourself, instead of being taught to observe what kept reacting to your movement. They needed you distracted by guilt instead of awareness. But awareness crept in anyway. You started asking the right questions. Why does momentum always trigger opposition? Why do the same doors close in coordinated ways? Why do certain people suddenly change behavior when you level up? Why does progress feel like it comes with consequences? Those questions aren't paranoia. They're perception sharpening. And once perception sharpens, the game changes. Because now you see what they hoped you'd miss. you're not moving alone. Forces beyond your immediate environment respond when you shift. When you step out of alignment with what's expected, something larger adjusts around you, sometimes to slow you down, sometimes to shield you, sometimes to redirect pressure away from you entirely. That's where the truth starts to get uncomfortable for the enemy. You weren't just resisting, you were being monitored. And monitored doesn't always mean targeted. Sometimes it means protected. Here's where chosen ones need to pay attention. There's a reason certain things never went as badly as they could have. There's a reason some situations dissolved before becoming disasters. There's a reason some people who seemed positioned to harm you lost momentum, lost interest, or lost access altogether. Those weren't lucky breaks. Those were interventions you weren't meant to notice. Because protection works best when it doesn't announce itself. You weren't supposed to connect the dots. You were supposed to stay focused on surviving the moment, not understanding the architecture behind it. But the moment you stopped attacking yourself and started observing the pattern, you crossed a threshold. You became aware of leverage. And leverage is power. That's why the pressure intensified when you started seeing clearly. That's why doubt was pushed harder. That's why distractions multiplied. Awareness threatens control more than rebellion ever could. A confused person can be managed. A clear one cannot. The enemy doesn't fear your anger. They fear your understanding. Because once you understand the pattern, you stop panicking. You stop reacting emotionally. You stop chasing explanations from people who benefit from keeping you in the dark. You move differently. You start recognizing when resistance is a signal, not a stop sign. You start understanding that pushback often confirms you're on the right path. You stop interpreting difficulty as failure and start seeing it as evidence of impact. And that's when their advantage erodes. Because now you're no longer asking, what's wrong with me? You're asking, what is responding to my movement? That question alone changes everything. It turns confusion into strategy, fear into focus, isolation into insight. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The truth you were never meant to notice isn't that life is unfair. It's that influence exists far beyond what's visible, and you're important enough to trigger it. That realization doesn't make you reckless. It makes you precise. And precision is what ends games quietly. Number 3, protected without permission. Support doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it works silently while you keep moving forward. Let that sit, because this is where most people misunderstand what's really been happening around you. You were never waiting to be rescued. You were already moving forward while something unseen adjusted the terrain ahead of you. That's the kind of support that doesn't clap, doesn't introduce itself, and doesn't need your awareness to be effective. It operates whether you believe in it or not. You didn't imagine how certain blows never landed. You didn't exaggerate how situations shifted at the last second. You didn't get lucky when plans against you collapsed without explanation. What you experienced was protection that didn't require your consent, your request, or your understanding. It moved independently of your emotions and far beyond your control. That's what unsettles the enemy the most. They assumed you were exposed because you weren't surrounded by noise. They assumed you were vulnerable because you weren't guarded by spectacle. They assumed no one important had your back because no one announced it publicly. What they failed to grasp is that real protection rarely performs. It works quietly, efficiently, and without witnesses. Think about how many times something should have gone wrong, but didn't. How often circumstances rearranged themselves just enough for you to pass through intact. How many confrontations lost momentum before they reached you. Those weren't pauses. Those were interventions. And the reason they happened without your involvement is simple. The kind of allies you have don't wait for approval. They act. Here's a question you've probably asked yourself, but never said out loud. If I'm protected, Why did I still struggle? Because protection isn't the absence of pressure. It's the regulation of damage. It doesn't remove obstacles. It prevents fatal outcomes. You were allowed to be tested, not terminated, challenged, not erased, delayed, not destroyed. There's a difference. The opposition expected your movement to trigger consequences they could control. Instead, every attempt to slow you down activated responses they couldn't trace. They pushed, and something pushed back harder, quieter, and with better positioning. That's when frustration set in. That's when tactics turned sloppy. That's when people who thought they were clever started exposing themselves. Because nothing rattles someone more than resistance they can't identify. You kept moving forward, thinking you were alone. Meanwhile, lines were being drawn you never saw. Limits were being enforced without announcements. Boundaries were being set without confrontation. You weren't spared because you asked nicely. You were spared because someone somewhere decided your momentum mattered more than someone else's agenda. That's not kindness, that's priority. And if you're wondering why this kind of protection chose you, here's the truth most people avoid. Not everyone can be protected quietly. Some people need supervision because they self-sabotage. Some people attract chaos because they can't move with discipline. Some people leak everything they touch. You don't. You move forward without broadcasting. You endure without advertising. You adapt without begging for attention. That makes you protectable. The enemy thought your lack of reinforcement meant isolation. What it actually meant was discretion. They expected warning signs. There were none. They expected retaliation. It never came. They expected you to expose your hand. You didn't. And while they were busy looking for proof that you were unsupported, decisions were being made that made their efforts irrelevant. That's the advantage of protection that doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It doesn't consult emotions. It doesn't need consensus. It simply removes risk before it reaches you. So when you feel that subtle confidence rising lately, the calm that doesn't match the chaos around you, understand where it comes from. It's not arrogance, it's alignment. It's the awareness that you're not moving through open territory. You're moving through a secured zone. Let the enemy keep guessing. Let them assume you're unguarded because they don't see a shield. The most effective protection doesn't shine. It intercepts. And while they're still trying to figure out how you keep slipping through untouched, you'll keep advancing. Steady, intact, and increasingly untouchable. Before we move forward, take a moment to support what we're building here. If this message hit you, if it gave you clarity, strength, or perspective, show that support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It tells the platform to push this message to others who need it just as much. Share this video with someone who's been fighting quietly. And if you want to go a step further, consider sending a super thanks. Your support helps the team keep investing time, energy, and focus into creating powerful, life-changing, high-impact content like this, consistently and without compromise. Number 4, why every setup backfired. When resistance keeps collapsing, it's often because momentum is already on your side. If you've been wondering why so many things meant to stop you ended up failing, misfiring, or outright exploding in the hands of the people who planned them, here's the truth. Most won't say out loud. Setups only work on targets that are actually vulnerable. And you haven't been vulnerable in the way they assumed. They thought resistance would slow you down. They thought pressure would exhaust you. They thought confusion would make you careless. Instead, every attempt to box you in sharpened your awareness. Every ambush forced you to read patterns faster. Every manufactured obstacle pushed you into a lane they couldn't follow. That's why it keeps backfiring. Momentum doesn't always look like speed. Sometimes it looks like stillness while everything around you loses balance. Sometimes it looks like silence while others reveal too much. Sometimes it looks like delay while forces you can't see rearrange the terrain ahead of you. From the outside, it may have looked like you were stalled. From the inside, you were aligning. And alignment beats aggression every time. The people who tried to set you up were operating from an outdated map. They assumed your position was exposed when it wasn't. They assumed your support was thin when it was layered. They assumed you were reacting when you were actually observing. That's the kind of misread that turns strategy into self-sabotage. You didn't need to counter every move. You didn't need to defend yourself loudly. You didn't need to explain your side. The environment itself started doing the work for you. Plans collapsed under their own weight. Stories contradicted themselves. Alliances built on shaky motives cracked the moment pressure was applied. That doesn't happen by accident. Here's the part that answers the question running through your mind. Why does it feel like things keep correcting themselves in my favor? Because when momentum shifts, it doesn't announce itself. It shows up as friction for everyone moving against it. People pushing the wrong direction start tripping over details they used to control. Timelines stop syncing. Communication breaks down. Confidence turns into recklessness. And suddenly, the same people who thought they were 5 steps ahead can't even manage the next move. You've seen it happen. Someone was sure they had you cornered, and then suddenly they were explaining themselves. Someone was confident they could block you, and then their own positions started eroding. Someone thought they were untouchable, and then exposure came from an angle they never anticipated. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when unseen leverage enters the equation. You weren't just dodging traps, you were being moved out of their range. You weren't just surviving attacks, you were being positioned where those attacks couldn't land cleanly, and the people trying to harm you couldn't understand why their usual tactics stopped working because they were fighting effects without understanding causes. They kept asking the wrong questions. How did this fail? Instead of, why doesn't this work on them anymore? And while they were busy blaming timing, luck, or other people, the truth was simpler and far more unsettling. The balance of power had shifted. Chosen ones don't win because they overpower everyone in front of them. They win because they're supported in ways that never show up on the surface. They move through systems with pressure being absorbed elsewhere. They advance while resistance wears itself out, trying to catch up. That's why the setups didn't just fail, they rebounded. A false narrative meant to trap you ended up exposing the person who spread it. A calculated delay meant to frustrate you created space that benefited you instead. An attempt to isolate you revealed who was actually overreaching. Each move they made tightened their own constraints while loosening yours. And the more desperate they became, the more obvious it was that they'd lost control. Here's your motivation in all of this. You don't need to force momentum that already exists. You don't need to chase validation when outcomes are speaking for you. You don't need to retaliate when gravity is already doing the work. Let them keep overplaying their hand. Let them keep assuming they're the smartest ones in the room. Let them keep mistaking temporary noise for lasting influence. Every miscalculation on their part accelerates the very outcome they're trying to avoid. Momentum doesn't favor the loudest, it favors the aligned. And if every setup meant to stop you keeps collapsing, it's because you're no longer moving against resistance. You're moving with something far stronger than it. Number 5, on the radar for the right reasons. Being observed doesn't always mean danger. It can mean recognition and opportunity. Here's a truth most people don't realize until much later. Being watched doesn't automatically mean you're in danger. Sometimes it means you've crossed a threshold. Sometimes it means your name has surfaced in rooms you've never entered. Sometimes it means people with real influence have started paying attention, not because you asked for it, but because you earned it. You didn't end up on the radar by accident. Chosen ones always feel that strange tension first, that sense that eyes are on you, that conversations change when you walk in, that reactions feel measured instead of casual. You might have wondered, why does it feel like I'm being evaluated? Or why does it seem like certain people are watching without saying much? The mistake would be assuming it's all hostile. Danger announces itself. Recognition stays quiet. The people who truly matter don't rush toward you with applause. They observe. They measure consistency. They watch how you move when no one is clapping, how you handle pressure when there's nothing to gain, how you respond when the situation turns against you. They don't care about performance, they care about pattern. And your pattern stood out. You didn't beg for attention. You didn't force visibility. You didn't try to dominate rooms you hadn't earned entry into. You stayed focused while others performed. You stayed steady while others overplayed their hand. That restraint is rare. That discipline signals something most people miss: control. People in high places are allergic to chaos. They've seen enough of it. They've learned the hard way that loud talent burns out and flashy ambition collapses under scrutiny. What they look for instead is composure, reliability, someone who doesn't crack when variables shift. That's why you're being watched for the right reasons. You weren't flagged because you're problematic. You were flagged because you're consistent, because your work doesn't wobble with emotion, because your integrity doesn't bend when incentives change, because you don't panic when pressure rises. Those traits don't go unnoticed. They get logged. They get remembered. And here's the part the enemy hates. The same attention they wanted to weaponize against you is the attention that's working in your favor. While some people tried to frame scrutiny as a threat, others saw it as confirmation. While critics attempted to magnify your mistakes, observers noticed how few there actually were. While noise surrounded your name, someone else was tracking how you navigated it without self-destructing. That's not surveillance, that's assessment. You may not know who's paying attention yet, and that's intentional. Real recognition doesn't introduce itself. It waits. It watches how you behave when you think no one important is looking. It studies whether you remain disciplined without supervision. It tests whether your character holds when shortcuts are available. And you pass tests you didn't even know you were taking. This is why opportunities around you feel delayed, then sudden. Why doors don't creak open slowly, but swing wide without warning. Why moments of stagnation are followed by sharp elevation. That's what happens when decisions are made quietly long before outcomes become visible. The enemy sees delay and assumes failure. The chosen understand delay often means review. And review is a privilege. Not everyone gets considered. Most get dismissed early. They burn bridges before they reach them. They expose themselves before they're ready. You didn't. You stayed intact long enough for someone to notice the difference. So if you've felt like your life has been under a microscope, don't assume it's because you're being hunted. Sometimes it's because you're being vetted, and there's a world of difference between the two. The ones who matter aren't asking, how loud are they? They're asking, how stable are they? Not, how fast can they rise? But, will they collapse when they do? Your continued presence answers those questions without you saying a word. This is why you shouldn't shrink, why you shouldn't dim yourself to avoid attention, why you shouldn't sabotage your own momentum out of fear of being seen. You were never meant to stay invisible. You were meant to be observed, evaluated, and eventually positioned. Let the wrong people reveal their insecurity through gossip and interference. The right people are too busy watching outcomes. And when recognition finally turns into opportunity, it won't come with an explanation. It will come with access. That's how you'll know the difference between being watched as a threat and being watched as an asset. You were never on the radar to be taken out. You were on the radar because someone saw what happens when you're left uninterrupted and decided that was worth backing. Number 6. Pressure was the training ground. What felt like hardship was actually conditioning you for strength you hadn't accessed yet. You don't discover strength in comfort. You discover it when everything tries to crush you and fails. What you called hardship wasn't random cruelty, and it wasn't bad luck. It was resistance applied with purpose. Pressure didn't enter your life to punish you. It entered to prepare you. And the fact that you're still here proves the conditioning worked. The enemy assumed pressure would weaken you. That's the mistake they always make. They believe stress fractures everyone the same way. They think fear erodes resolve. They think isolation creates dependence. But pressure doesn't destroy what's built with depth. It reveals it. It exposes structure. It shows what bends and what holds. You weren't drowning. You were learning how to breathe under weight. Think back to the moments that felt unbearable. The stretch where nothing moved forward. The stretch where support disappeared. The stretch where it seemed like every option narrowed at once. You probably asked yourself, why is this happening to me? Why does it feel like I'm being tested beyond reason? Because surface-level strength wouldn't survive what's coming next. Only internal reinforcement would. Pressure stripped away what you didn't need. It removed illusions. It forced you to operate without applause, without backup, without guarantees. That wasn't abandonment. It was calibration. When noise vanished, you learned how to listen. When safety disappeared, you learned how to assess risk. When comfort left, you learned how to move with precision. The enemy saw those seasons as opportunities to finish you off. What they didn't realize was that every time you endured without collapsing, your tolerance expanded. Your reaction time sharpened. Your emotional control increased. You stopped panicking and started calculating. That's not survival instinct, that's training. Pressure taught you restraint. It taught you when not to respond. It taught you the value of silence. It taught you that not every provocation deserves your energy. While others react impulsively, you learned how to wait, how to observe, how to let situations expose themselves without interference. That's not weakness, that's command. Ask yourself honestly, could the version of you from before handle what you can handle now? Could they remain composed where you now remain steady? Could they endure what no longer shakes you? The answer tells you everything. Pressure didn't just test you, it upgraded you. This is where chosen ones separate from the crowd. Most people fold under sustained resistance. They either numb themselves or become loud to mask the damage. You did neither. You adapted. You refined. You internalized lessons others avoid. And that's why pressure followed you longer than it follows most. Because the process wasn't finished yet. You were being trained to operate while targeted, to stay focused while opposed, to function without validation, to carry responsibility without recognition. These aren't skills taught in comfort. They're learned when mistakes cost more and endurance matters. The enemy thought repetition would wear you down. Instead, repetition built muscle. The same challenges kept appearing not because you failed, but because each round increased your capacity. They thought you were stuck in a loop. You were actually leveling up. Now here's the part they didn't anticipate. Pressure also taught you discernment. You learned who disappears when things get heavy. You learned who only shows up when there's something to gain. You learned how to read intention instead of words. That alone makes you dangerous. Because pressure didn't just strengthen you, it clarified you. So if you're wondering why you feel different now, why you're less reactive, less desperate, less shaken by uncertainty, it's because the conditioning worked. You're no longer operating from raw emotion. You're operating from awareness. And that's exactly why the enemy is uncomfortable now. Pressure was never meant to break you. It was meant to harden you without turning you hollow, to give you control without cruelty, to teach you endurance without bitterness. You weren't being punished. You were being prepared to move in environments where softness wouldn't survive. The training ground was brutal because the role ahead demands stability under fire. So don't resent the pressure. It revealed what you're capable of carrying, and now that you've been conditioned, what once felt heavy won't stop you. It won't even slow you down. Number 7. When silence replaces opposition. The absence of noise often means power has shifted, not disappeared. When your enemies stop talking about you, it's not peace, it's permission being revoked. Pay attention to the silence, not the calm kind, not the restful kind, but the sudden, unnatural quiet that follows months or years of resistance. That silence isn't confusion, it isn't mercy, and it definitely isn't coincidence. Silence is what happens when opposition realizes it no longer has the authority to interfere. This is the phase most people misunderstand. They think the fight ended because interest faded, because people moved on, because the threat was exaggerated. That's a comforting lie. The truth is far more precise and far more intimidating. The noise stopped because power shifted hands. You felt it before you understood it. The tension lifted without explanation. The constant pushback evaporated. People who once had your name in their mouths suddenly couldn't remember how to pronounce it. Not because you became irrelevant, but because mentioning you became risky. That's not absence, that's enforcement. Let's address what's running through your mind right now. Why did they back off? Why did the pressure disappear so abruptly? Why does it feel like something happened without me being told? Because the most consequential decisions are never announced to the person being protected. You don't get a memo when leverage changes, you just experience the result. Opposition doesn't vanish on its own. People don't abandon control unless it's removed from them. The loudest enemies are never the most powerful ones. They're the ones who think they have room to operate. When that room disappears, so does their voice. Silence is what happens when someone higher up says, "That's enough." The chosen ones need to understand this clearly. Chaos is noisy, control is quiet. When you were vulnerable, everyone had an opinion. When you were accessible, everyone had access. When you were easy to challenge, challenges came non-stop. But now, the volume dropped, the commentary stalled, the constant friction dissolved. That doesn't happen by accident. Think of it like a switch being flipped in a building you're not allowed to enter. The lights don't flicker for long, they just go out, and the people inside don't run around screaming about it. They adjust because they were told to. That's what's happening around you. Your enemies didn't suddenly mature. They didn't gain perspective. They didn't grow bored. They were outmatched in a way that made persistence dangerous. And once persistence carries consequences, silence becomes self-preservation. This is where your role matters. Because silence tempts the chosen to relax too much, to second-guess, to wonder if it was all in their head. It wasn't. Silence is confirmation. Silence is evidence that something moved behind the scenes without your involvement. You weren't meant to witness the shift. You were meant to benefit from it. And here's the part that should recalibrate how you move from this point forward. When opposition goes quiet, it doesn't mean you stop. It means you advance without resistance, slowing you down. Silence isn't a finish line, it's a cleared path. Your enemies understand something they'll never admit publicly. Continuing to oppose you costs more than it's worth. That calculation didn't come from fear of you alone. It came from understanding who stands beyond you, who has reach they don't, and who doesn't negotiate twice. That's why the attacks didn't just weaken, they stopped. That's why the interference didn't fade, it ended. That's why the rumors didn't evolve, they died. And you didn't have to confront anyone. You didn't have to explain yourself. You didn't have to defend your name. That's how real protection works. It removes friction without dragging you into the process. Silence is strategic. Silence is containment. Silence is the sound of boundaries being enforced without spectacle. So if you're waiting for closure, stop. This is it. Silence is the closure. It's the answer to every moment you wondered if you were imagining the resistance. It's the confirmation that the pressure you endured wasn't pointless. It triggered a response you weren't meant to see. Now, understand the danger of this moment. When the noise stops, the chosen either level up or lose momentum. This is where you're tested again, not by attack, but by opportunity. Can you move without friction? Can you build without distraction? Can you stay disciplined when no one is trying to stop you? Because silence creates space, and space is where momentum compounds. Your enemies didn't disappear, they were neutralized, and neutralization doesn't require drama, it requires authority. So move forward with clarity. Don't announce anything, don't provoke anything. Let the quiet speak for itself. When opposition replaces noise with distance, it's not because you became smaller. It's because something larger stepped in and said, "This one is no longer available for interference." And once that happens, the smartest move the enemy can make is to stay silent and hope you never notice why. Number 8. Selection through endurance. Consistency under pressure separates those who break from those who rise. Pressure doesn't just test people, it sorts them. It draws a hard line between those who fracture the moment resistance appears and those who adjust, stabilize, and keep moving. What you went through wasn't random adversity, it was a filter. While others folded under the weight, you stayed consistent when everything around you was designed to disrupt your rhythm. That alone marked you. Not because you were loud about it, not because you demanded recognition, but because you didn't stop showing up when stopping would have been understandable. The enemy assumed pressure would scatter you. They believed stress would force mistakes, impatience, emotional reactions they could exploit. That's how they've seen it work with most people. Apply enough tension, and eventually something snaps. But what they didn't account for was your ability to stay steady when conditions turned hostile. You didn't rush. You didn't panic. You didn't abandon your long game just because the environment got uncomfortable. That kind of consistency isn't common, and it doesn't go unnoticed. Here's what the chosen ones need to hear clearly. Endurance is not passive, it's active resistance. It's waking up and staying aligned when circumstances are trying to knock you off balance. It's continuing your work when motivation dries up. It's refusing to self-sabotage when provoked. Anyone can perform when things are smooth. Very few can maintain structure when everything around them applies force. That's why endurance is selection. You may have wondered why the pressure seemed relentless. Why as soon as one problem ended, another appeared. Why the intensity didn't let up when you proved yourself. The answer is simple and inconvenient. The test wasn't about whether you could survive one hit. It was about whether you could hold your form over time. Consistency reveals character more accurately than talent ever could. Anyone can spike once. Very few can sustain without losing themselves. The enemy grew frustrated because you didn't give them what they expected. No dramatic collapse, no public unraveling, no reckless decisions born from desperation. You absorbed pressure without advertising the strain. You adapted quietly, and every time you stayed upright, it sent a signal beyond the immediate battlefield. Signals travel, especially when they show someone who can be leaned on without breaking. This is where unseen allies come into play, whether you realized it or not. Endurance is readable. People in positions of influence don't bet on potential alone. They bet on reliability under stress. They watch who remains functional when chaos spikes, who doesn't leak under pressure, who doesn't become volatile when challenged. Your consistency under fire spoke on your behalf long before you ever had access to rooms that matter. That's why certain situations didn't escalate the way they should have. That's why pressure was applied but never allowed to crush you completely. That's why interference showed up just in time, again and again, without explanation. Endurance attracts protection because it proves return on investment. No one shields what can't hold its shape. But when someone demonstrates they can endure without imploding, support tends to appear, quietly, strategically. The enemy misread endurance as stagnation. They thought because you weren't making noise, you weren't advancing. They confused stillness with weakness. Meanwhile, you were building tolerance, strengthening systems, learning how to function efficiently under load, and that's dangerous for anyone hoping you'd burn out. Ask yourself this: how many people around you started strong but disappeared when things got heavy? How many talked big until consistency was required? You didn't outlast them by being better, you outlasted them by being steadier, and that's the trait that separates those who are briefly impressive from those who are quietly unstoppable. You weren't selected because you never felt pressure. You were selected because pressure didn't make you unreliable. You kept your standards when shortcuts were tempting. You kept your composure when reaction would have been justified. You kept moving when quitting would have been reasonable. That pattern doesn't blend in, it stands out. So understand this moving forward. Consistency under pressure didn't just help you survive, it positioned you. It signaled that you're someone who can be trusted in unstable conditions, someone who doesn't need constant supervision, someone who can carry weight without broadcasting strain. That's why the pressure didn't remove you, it revealed you. And now, whether the enemy likes it or not, you're no longer being tested to see if you'll break. You've already answered that question. Number 9. The moment you stop being guarded and start advancing. True confidence begins when you move forward, knowing you no longer need permission or validation. The day you stop checking who's watching is the day you realize you were never walking alone. There's a moment, quiet, internal, irreversible, when something shifts inside you. It doesn't announce itself. There's no applause, no signal flare, but suddenly you move differently, not cautiously, not defensively, you advance. And that's when the balance of power changes. Up until now, protection felt external, like something around you, like a barrier absorbing impact while you stayed focused on surviving. But survival was only the first phase. Survival teaches endurance. Advancement demands certainty. And the moment you step into that certainty, you stop behaving like someone waiting for approval and start moving like someone who already knows the outcome. This is the part the enemy never plans for. They were comfortable when you were guarded. Guarded people hesitate. Guarded people look back. Guarded people wonder if it's safe to move. But advancing people don't wait for clearance. They don't ask for consensus. They don't seek validation from rooms that never intended to include them. Advancing people already know they're cleared. You feel it when it happens. The internal noise quiets. The urge to explain yourself fades. The need to be understood dissolves. You stop rehearsing conversations that will never happen. You stop justifying decisions that don't require permission. You stop trying to prove you belong in spaces you've already outgrown. And that's when confidence becomes dangerous. Not loud confidence, not performative confidence, the kind that posts, boasts, and begs to be noticed. This is different. This is structural confidence, the kind that shows up as calm, as precision, as forward motion without commentary. The enemy senses this before they can articulate it. They feel the shift because their leverage depended on your hesitation, their influence depended on your self-doubt, their access depended on your need for approval. Once those things disappear, so does their relevance. You're no longer reacting, you're deciding. That's why some people suddenly get nervous when you stop explaining yourself. That's why certain voices grow louder when you grow quieter. That's why resistance spikes right before momentum becomes unstoppable. They're not responding to what you're doing. They're responding to what they can no longer control. Let's address the question you might be asking right now. How do I know I'm ready to advance? You don't feel reckless. You feel clear. You don't feel rushed. You feel aligned. You don't feel angry. You feel focused. Advancement doesn't come from emotion. It comes from awareness, from recognizing patterns, from seeing how often things moved out of your way without you forcing them, from noticing how obstacles dissolved once you stopped trying to convince people who were committed to misunderstanding you. You didn't lose protection when you started advancing. Protection changed form. It stopped being a wall and became momentum. It stopped blocking attacks and started collapsing resistance ahead of you. That's why things feel different now. You're no longer looking over your shoulder because you're no longer walking backward. You're no longer scanning faces for approval because you're too busy watching the path open in front of you. You're no longer asking if it's allowed because you've realized the rules were never meant for you in the first place. They were meant to slow you down. The enemy thrived when you were contained, when you questioned yourself, when you waited for consensus. But advancement doesn't wait. Advancement doesn't negotiate with fear. Advancement doesn't pause to explain its purpose to people who benefit from your stagnation. And here's the truth that hits hardest. The moment you advance, you expose who was only powerful because you stayed still. They don't lose power because you attack them. They lose power because you outgrow them. You start making moves they can't track. You stop telegraphing your intentions. You stop seeking acknowledgement for every step. And suddenly, the same people who tried to block you are scrambling to understand how you passed them without confrontation. That's not arrogance. That's evolution. Chosen ones don't announce their transition. They demonstrate it. They let results speak. They let silence do the heavy lifting. They let forward motion answer questions that arguments never could. So if you feel that shift, if you sense that you're done waiting, done explaining, done shrinking, trust it. That's not recklessness. That's readiness. You're no longer being held back for safety. You're being propelled for impact. And the enemy knows it.